Nigel Byford. He's worked with probation for over 35 years, having started in the voluntary sector and with social services. And his experience has included frontline and managerial positions in almost every aspect of probation work, including secondment with the prison service. For the last 15 years, he's been an assistant chief probation officer in my part of the country, West Midlands, leading on protection work for probation, public protection work. He's now leading on public protection policy with specific responsibilities for MAPA, extremism, safeguarding victims and seconded probation staff in prisons. So without further ado, let me hand over to you, Nigel. Thank you.
Hi, thanks very much, Melanie, and thanks for the opportunity of talking with you today. They always say the slot after dinner is a difficult one, and I guess if Melanie's getting you to do evaluation forms, you're probably going to be evaluating your own lunch, which will be an interesting change. So yeah, I've been around for quite a while, not quite as long as the court missionaries, but certainly long enough to see how probation has sort of changed over the years, really. And it seems quite a while ago we used to talk about advise, assist and befriend. And then around the 90s we kind of moved into much more kind of public protection role, with the minister at the time talking about how central probation were to that. And it's interesting that the probation service today, with all our satellite tracking, electronic monitoring, with recently introducing alcohol tags that detect whether people have been drinking or not, and there are plans to expand the use of lie detection through polygraph. So technology is kind of quite a big part of where probation is at the moment. I guess in terms of what I was going to talk about today, I've got a few slides. I'm going to share those on the screen, and I'll probably talk for about 15 minutes or so, but I guess the conversation is probably where we need to be in talking about this this world of unification and probation coming back together again. I guess if you're a fan of the Spice Girls, you can recall the song Two Becoming One. It's not become the national anthem for probation yet, but I have suggested that. Anyway, so if you just bear with me while I try and make the technology work, then we should be good to go. So let me just get that moving. Okay, can I just check, is that showing through on people's screens? Lovely. Thanks, Melanie. I love the hands up. Feels very very Romanesque. If that thumb goes down, I'll know I'm doing something something wrong. Okay, so this is really wanted to talk about a few things, really, because since 2019, that's when the probation reform was announced and the unification of probation services. The speech is actually on YouTube if you want to watch that again, from David Gork. But also in 2019 there was another significant change, really, and that was about how prisoners are managed. And I thought I'd probably just talk a little bit about that as well. Then in 2020 we were into quite a lot of activity around transformation and preparing for the new unified model. And the magic date, which won't change, is June the 26th this year. And that's when it will become the new National Probation Service. There has been some conversation about possibly changing that name, but I don't think it will happen. So that's kind of where we are as well. And then in the background, of course, there have been a number of other significant activities. So things like parole and the War Boys case, issues around victims, the fact that victims now get a summary of the parole board decision, and that's available to media as well. And there's some consultation at the moment about victims being able to sit through a whole parole hearing. So there are a lot of things changing alongside issues around probation as well. So just a couple of bits really around offender management in custody, or OMIC as it's called. And for those of you who've got links to prison, I'm sure this will be familiar to you. But the reason I've wanted just to talk about this is a really significant development. The original idea was continuous offender management. That's when we started back in the early 20s. It was the whole bit about you have one person that follows you all the way through. It didn't really work very well. There were some faults on the probation side in terms of maintaining contact with prisoners, and there were also significant problems on the prison side in terms of them being able to sustain prison officers doing offender management work. But then we came with a big review. HMIP basically said to NOMS at the time, you really need to review the work you're doing on this and come up with something better. It's a really interesting HMIP report that I think was released on New Year's Eve. It was an interesting time when it came out. But what that's meant is a massive investment. So the number of prison officers has gone up, and that's allowed the residential staff to become key workers, meaning they're having direct contact with prisoners. And then you've got the prison offender manager, who's now referred to as the POM, and the community offender manager is the COM. So POM-COM working together as we go forward. And then linked to that is reconfiguration of prisons. So significant changes here, the kind of thing that's been talked about for years, really. So for example, Birmingham will become pretty well just holding remand prisoners, and other prisons are having their designation changed. And the final bit on this slide really was, as we've moved into OMIC, then the senior probation officer role in the prison has changed, and it's changed quite significantly. So they become the heads of quality offender management, sit on the governor's top team, and they're responsible for that quality approach. But of course, during this time, we've had COVID, and that's really impacted on fully developing OMIC. A number of areas had to pull probation staff out to support the front line in the community. Key thing for me will be this importance of handover, and that's about not leaving information behind. So when the POM is transferring the case to the COM, around about 7 months before release, we've really got to make sure it is the complete package that's handed over. And that's an area that we're quite focused on at the moment. But the link into unification is the through the gate work that CRCs have been doing. That's going to be rebadge resettlement. And in that world of resettlement, I think there is a new opportunity coming with unification. Just very brief on this. This is 2014. This is the National Probation Service, what it was doing, and CRCs, what they were doing. Broadly, low, medium risk cases in the CRCs developing programs, and then the high risk and any MAPA cases within MPS. But we've moved on to that, and we're moving to this unified model. And we're bringing this, bringing the two elements really. So there's been some excellent work in CRCs, and it's just bringing that into this new unified organization. So there's a huge investment. If you look at the paperwork around unification, it's around about 150 million. Now some of that, of course, is, can't say smoke and mirrors, but it's basically reinvesting and efficiency savings, but it is a significant amount of money coming into probation. But the other bit is that we've had 7 probation divisions, and that's now going to go to 12 probation regions, and each region has a regional director and management team. So and they are in place at the moment. So I just wanted to, this isn't, I apologize for this, it probably doesn't come through very clearly, and it's a little bit distorted, but these are the new regions that we have. So where I work, which is in West Midlands, until recently, it used to be just the Midlands division. So our area sort of span from Lincoln right the way through to Hereford. There's a massive area to cover. But these are now being made into smaller areas, but obviously that then involves former CRC staff and MPS staff. Just wanted to touch on this. This is a breakdown really of what it's going to look like under that regional probation director. So just working briefly across from the left-hand side, you'll see there's a head of operations, and then below that, the head of probation delivery unit. And that's the new terminology for a local area. So whereas we may have talked about Birmingham or the Warwickshire area or the Bedford area, that will now be the Bedfordshire or Birmingham PDU. And then, so there, beneath that, then you'll have the usual probation staff, the offender management team, court teams, etc. You then have the head of public protection, which is a role I'm currently holding. And that's all things, you could say all things dodgy, if you like, but it's basically victims, some work around the female world, and then a keener focus really on MAPA, linking to prisons, psychologists, although we don't have any at the moment. And you can add on to that areas like extremism, serious organised crime, all areas that over the last, maybe the last 10 years, the probation service has become much more involved in. Let me move on to Mps Interventions. And this is where the CRC footprint is coming in a very clear way. So the only programs that MPS have provided have been the sex offender programs. So obviously within this world, we're bringing in all the accredited programs, the unpaid work, and other interventions. And then we move on to head of community integration. And this is an interesting development, particularly for MPS. So this is around commissioning. We've always worked in partnership, but we're now going to have money available to invest and to commission services as well. And I think I'll touch more on this later on. And then the rest are primarily kind of usual corporate services. So the implementation date is the 26th of June, and the current focus is on ensuring that we're ready for that date. But it's not going to be, things aren't going to change on the 26th of June, and the 27th of June is going to look very like the 26th of June. Because at the moment it's more around harmonizing issues around pay and conditions, contractual issues with all the staff. So this is being referred to as lift and shift. Not the best terminology, but that effectively is what's happening. So CRC staff and their senior probation officers, their managers, they'll basically just move and be in the same unit with the same caseloads. And then there'll be a gradual shift over time. And clearly there's got to be a huge amount of training provided for staff in getting up to speed with the different approaches. I just want to touch on the dynamic framework. This is the new framework for commissioning services, and it'll also be used around resettlement services. So for some CRCs, they have what's referred to as a supply chain with various other organisations providing some of these services at the moment. And unless the bidding is completed and the contracts are awarded around particular areas such as employment and accommodation, then those staff that have been working in those areas will transfer to those providers. And I think at the moment, probably the biggest anxiety for CRC staff is just making sure they're clear about where they're going to end up. So this new framework is going to be launched in June, and from that framework, it would be possible for a regional director to say they'd like to commission a particular type of service, and that could vary on local need as we go forward. So the services that are going to be in place on the 26th of June under this dynamic framework will be around accommodation, employment, training and education, personal wellbeing and women's services. And then there are other categories of services which I've listed on there, which will follow on after that. Okay, now underpinning all this is what's referred to as the TOM, or the Target Operating Model. It's 211 pages. I thought it might be a bit too much to put on the slideshow today, but the TOM is available if you were interested in having a read of this. It sets out the basis of how the new MPS is going to be operating. And there's a few highlights on here. This is very slightly out of date because it says we plan to publish the operating model in February, and it has now been published. And you'll see the kind of key areas there around advice to courts, resettlement, the dynamic framework that we've just touched on, a new term of sentence management. So probation have always tended to use the term offender management and offender managers, but this is now changing to sentence management. And then again, the unpaid work, accredited programs, and the ROIF, which is the Regional Outcomes and Innovation Fund. So again, this is a pot of money available to regional directors to begin to look at what could possibly be commissioned locally to meet local need. And then again, from the 26th of June, national standards. We seem to have gone through a little bit of a circle with national standards. At one stage, they were very, very prescriptive that certain things had to be done at fixed points, certain times. And then over years, we moved to professional judgment and taken away some of those fixed term points. And at the moment, we're back into some fixed term points within the national standards. So the idea around this is that this will be in place and provide the framework for CRCs, MPS coming together and working together. And then that'll be reviewed in 2022. My personal view is that national standards are here to stay, and I can't see them being changed really. So really the future. So it's going to unify probation delivery under a single organisation. I mentioned earlier on about the 155 million that's being put in to support this development. And at the moment, a huge focus on training. Across the country, there are significant gaps in probation staff and probation officers in particular. So at the moment, we are investing a lot of time in recruiting and getting people through training courses, but it's not a quick process. Training a probation officer, depending on previous experience, is either a 15-month or a 21-month process. And COVID has made that slightly more difficult because the opportunity for direct engagement with offenders, the opportunity for observing other probation staff holding meetings or group work has been seriously curtailed as we've run in what's referred to as an exceptional delivery model under COVID. But that's the way we're going, and I think probably it's going to take us a couple of years to get to a point where we're saying that we are fully staffed. So probably in terms of unification, the way to look at this is unification on the 26th of June will see a single organisation. But within that organisation, not a huge amount is going to be changing straight away. And that's going to be a gradual approach to working out how we're going to deliver the new services going forward. And I think that's as far as I wanted to go in terms of talking to you. I'm sorry that's a little bit longer than I intended, so apologies for that. But happy to take any questions that people wanted to raise.
Thank you very much for that, Nigel. The title for this conference is Finding Hope in Difficult Times, and all the morning speakers, including me, have really struggled to pull some hope, out of the hat, so to speak. But I think what you've said has given us a lot of hope. What I'm hoping particularly is just the the sort of punitive rhetoric, sometimes driven by the popular press, isn't going to, it always seems to direct itself at community sentences, you know, being sort of wimpish, you know, lock them up, throw away the key. I just hope that all this good work can, you know, withstand that that awful rhetoric and punitive talk that we have. Have you any comment on that?
I think it's an interesting point you're raising, Melanie, because I think what you have within probation, obviously for a probation officer working in the field, one of their biggest concerns is somebody they're supervising doing something awful and committing a serious further offence. And I think staff generally have that fear and what that means for them and the level of scrutiny. And obviously that gets reflected in headings which we'll talk about failings within probation. We've actually, I mean, I think the figure is something like 250,000 people under probation supervision in the community. It's a large number of people, but obviously every one of those events is traumatic for the families concerned. And I've been dealing with an issue like that from last night and running through today. So that is really difficult. I think there are lots of attempts to try and promote probation. You'll find a lot more on YouTube now around probation and what probation officers do, good news stories. And I think that is a kind of key part of the new oversight, if you like, of probation now, to try and to promote that. But it's an easy headline, and we still have, you'll still get the headline saying so-and-so was released early. And of course, the reality was they were released at 50% of their sentence. That's the law, they had to come out. But it will still be a heading of so-and-so released early. So it's always been an issue, and it will continue to be an issue, I think.
Let's take a few questions. Tim, we haven't had any questions from you so far. So could you unmute yourself and let's have your question.
I wanted to ask Nigel, thank you very much for the presentation. At last I begin to understand some of the complexity. I was wondering about persuading courts that really the alternative to prisons looks much brighter now. Is that a possibility?
There is a part of the target operating model and that whole document. There's a big section on courts and seeking to influence courts and higher levels of engagement with magistrates. I think there may be magistrates on the call, but anecdotally, I think magistrates would probably welcome the unification of the service, bringing people back together again. We've had this strange arrangement really where MPS have been the ones that talk to the courts, not CRC. MPS are the ones that talk to the parole board, not CRC, and I think changing that around will help. Biggest problem at the moment again is COVID and the backlog, and there are a lot of serious cases that are a little bit stacked up in the system at the moment. So in answer to your question, Tim, yeah, quite a focus on making courts and that relationship with courts work better. So I'm sorry for dipping out a few minutes ago. The internet completely collapsed. I wasn't trying to duck questions.
Well, you haven't. We're on to you now anyway, Nigel. So any questions for Nigel before we move on to our next speaker? Janet, could you unmute and let's have your question.
I just wanted to ask whether the intention in the end is for all short sentencing to be diverted to probation and not go to prison. And it looks as though probation is going to do a lot in the areas of the last speaker.
I think, I mean, that would be the aim, to try and divert more people away from custodial sentences. But the other bits that is being proposed in this model, and we're beginning to start it now, is the creation of short sentence teams. So it's trying to have a much stronger focus on that revolving door bit and people going in and out. So there are some pilots on that at the moment, and that will be part of the model. I have put a link to the target operating model. I sent that to Kaz. So if she's able to share that with people, then that would be a nice nocturnal read for you of your 211 pages, but there is stuff in there covering that as well.
Right, Sue, could we have your question, please?
Yes, having been, oh, sorry, the other Sue?
Well, we're going to have both of you, so can we keep them fairly concise, please? Yes, we'll have, I was thinking Bounce, but let's go with you, Sue Myers, and then Sue Bounce, and a quick word from Steve. So in that order, please.
Yeah, having been involved in prison visiting and rehabilitation, which is very, very poor, how hopeful are you about working on rehabilitation issues?
I've got to be hopeful, Sue. There's quite a lot of discussion at the moment about the sort of resettlement bit. So that part where people are coming out of prison, and where I think we really need to be focused on providing the support. So at the moment, the CRC through the gate teams are kind of covering that area, but there isn't a clear link to the offender management side. And I think we've got to make that much stronger. So in the new world, there will be what they call resettlement teams, and that is the pure focus. So that's a kind of much more joined up approach. A new computer platform that means that people can say, I need this type of service for this individual, and they can kind of book it online. This is new, and it sounds simple, but hopefully it'll work. It'll take a while to develop, but yeah, I'm optimistic.
Thank you.
Sue Bounce, please.
Thank
you.
Over the last 10 years, I think I have watched the prison population get older, and to have very many, I was going to say get old to the extent that they'd need to go up to an old people's home, or to have disabilities that would require some sort of additional assistance in the community. It's been seen coming for a long time, but the provision for them within the prison service has lagged behind. And I wonder how far the probation service has been able to look ahead at how to resettle them in the community.
Okay, so there's a couple of bits to that. I mean, yes, clearly recognise that. And one of the issues that I think we quite often talk about is a high risk elderly individual, and how do you manage and support them in the community, because you might use the approved premises as a base for them, but a lot of our approved premises aren't geared to providing first floor accommodation or wheelchair access. And the other bit about this is that obviously they have to have an adult safeguarding, a social care assessment, and getting the local authority involved in doing that. And sometimes we've had debates between different local authorities as who's responsible, and it becomes a really complicated area. So I don't underestimate, we do have a problem. There is an elderly prison population there that we're going to have to do much more work with. At the moment, it's slightly worse because the approved premises, because of COVID, they're only offering single room accommodation. So we don't have the capacity in the approved premises have dropped. I suppose the good thing, and one of the things that's come on the back of COVID, is each probation area has had to create a homeless prevention team. And that's involved local authorities and various health and various other people. And we're going to carry on with that. And there's a much stronger focus on accommodation now than there was before. It's always been, we need accommodation. This time, I think we've got a bit more joined up government support around it as well. So again, I'm optimistic. To go back to Melody's point, I think there is hope about improving that area of the operation.